So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and a return to the tournament battles after a short time off. Of course, the group stage of the, well, for lack of a better term, the group stage of the tournament was what transpired previously, and this isn't really the quarter-final, it's more of a playoff to get into the semi-final, because for those of you who did not catch the group stages of the tournament, it ran on a round-robin system, essentially, in the first rounds. And of course, the better your record, the higher up the rankings you would go. Ranks 1 to 2 get a bye into the semi-finals, and then ranks 3 through 6 then have to engage in a couple of playoff matches to join them. Anyone ranked below 6th is of course eliminated at the first hurdle. Also, I think a few new maps were added into the rotation for the knockout rounds, because as much as this is actually an older map than all of the other pitch battles we've seen before, this is the dry lake bed, so a different pitch map than the ones that we saw before. But of course, the dry lake bed is a very simplistic map in the grand scheme of things, so the way in which pitch battles will work out is not going to be terribly different. But let's not waste any further time and let's get right down to business then. Starting off with the blue team over here, we have Django and his ally over there, FFAmuffins, as the first team, and they are going to be playing as Arthedain and Dorwinion. So Dorwinion over here, interesting kind of faction. They're very well balanced in terms of the fact that you have a good human core of units, and then you also have some nice elven support in and around them for the real damage dealing and high-end capabilities of the faction. They don't have the biggest roster, however, so when you are facing against Dorwinion, the only real thing you need to that will vary their roster a little bit is whether they're in a siege or on a field battle like this, and how much money they have available to them. Morroquendi Stalkers, I think, when it comes to Dorwinion, taking to the open field are always going to be an important part of their makeup. As much as horse archers can be zoned out effectively by enemy ranged units, and of course anti-cavalry in melee, especially considering the slightly lower armour values that these elven units do tend to have in Dorwinion, the Morroquendi Stalkers still give you that map control, that speed, and of course the damage that elven archers are known for dealing, as well as the extra little bonus of poison projectiles as well, which in this sort of situation could make a real difference, because morale, of course, if you can rout off a section of your enemy's force, that can give you all the momentum you need in a fast and frenetic pitch battle such as this. Elvelyn units are the rank and file of Dorwinion, and an effective force being that they are the Elvelyn Vanguard, a good defensive unit. The Dorwinion troops in general tend to have good armour values matched with good stamina. They're not the most numerous human units, but they do have a little bit of an edge in quality over a few of the other basic forces because of that elven training. But of course, you know, Dorwinion doesn't have as high a population as some of the others, so again, it makes a certain amount of sense that even their human units are a little bit lower in terms of manpower. Not too much though. They still will do very much the same sort of job, just with maybe a little bit more staying power in terms of their stamina. A couple of units of Morroquendi bows in behind. I mean, I would suggest that in a pitch battle like this, especially if you intend to be aggressive, the elven archer forces like this tend to be the better pick, because it's very unlikely that you're going to be engaged in a really elongated skirmishing battle, in which case their higher cost and lower armour could prove to be a bit more of a liability than you would want. But in this situation, the damage you can do initially with their higher base damage and their poison arrows, of course, does make a good deal of sense. And even if they do get engaged in melee, elven units like this do tend to be able to defend themselves better than the vast majority of human archers. But again, that is case by case. There are some human archers that can mix it with the very best. Elvelyn infantry are a little bit better in sort of general combat, especially when it comes to dealing damage because of those swords that they wield, though they lack the anti-cavalry bonus, of course, which on a pitch battle is definitely something that you want to be prioritising, at least to a certain extent. Just in behind we have the Nandor Glade Riders, a unit of lightly armoured but very damaging off-the-charge units of Lance Cavalry. Again, if they can get a good charge, you know, pitch battles like this are often won in singular moments, more so than siege battles are, and cavalry like this, especially seeing as in the tournament battles we've seen so far, basic units of cavalry, Lance Cavalry in particular, have proven to be pretty decisive, so we'll see if that's the case again. Morroquendi Glade Lords, however, are the upper echelon of the Dorwinion force. Very, very scary unit of knights, one of the better units of all-round Lance Cavalry that the game has to offer. Where they do fall down a little bit in comparison to some of their elven brethren is the fact that their armour values, even at this really high end, are not going to be quite as strong as the likes of Imladris. But overall, of course, they will still do much the same sort of thing, with clattering charges and a decent amount of staying power as well. Elvelyn infantry backed up by Morroquendi pikes here in the middle. This is a solid centre to the line. It's something that you will often see in a pitch battle, to have that centre be a phalanx force. It means you can't be broken right through the middle, essentially. The pikes make for a really good anchor, and of course cavalry is also curtailed by them a bit as well, but they will be one of the first targets for any sort of ranged units because of how effective they are in that role. River Patrol, I think cheap javelins maybe are more of a dead cert in a siege battle, but they're still cheap enough and still damaging enough to the point where they can prove to be a real problem for opposing forces. But I think cavalry, which is the main weakness of a unit like this, is obviously more prevalent in this sort of situation, so it does require a little bit more finesse, and we'll see if Django can keep these guys safe, surrounded as they are by their compatriots. That should be fine. More Elvelyn, more Nandor, and then we also have a ballista crew over here manned by elves, and a ballista has been a pretty common sight in these pitch battles in the tournament, just to try and manipulate where your opponent moves. We'll see how effective the ballista can be. Moving on to FFAmuffins' army, Arthedain, of course, a human and Dunland faction. Arthedain marksmen are much more of the standard rank and file, comfortable in a skirmish, reasonably priced human archer, in comparison to the more damaging Morroquendi we saw from his ally, but they should be okay considering their opponents across the way being Dunland. They should hold the advantage at long range, but whether or not Dunland allow the fight to be fought at long range for any sort of length of time remains to be seen. It's only one unit of them, mind you. The other archer, on the other hand, the Wardens of the North, very, very dangerous. Those armour-piercing projectiles will be looking to hunt down elite units, and then much like the Elven units, only to an even greater extent, the Wardens of the North can be very effective melee combatants as well. So you can definitely see why FFAmuffins has decided to bring them. Arthedain men-at-arms with the armour upgrades as well, especially when you upgrade their armour like this. They do have 20 units more than the equivalent Elvelyn. When you upgrade the armour, it makes them kind of equivalent, I would suggest. The 20 extra men offset by the fact that the Elvelyn have that Elven training to fall back on. Very much the same sort of thing though. I mean, human sword and board units, especially for the cost of these kinds of units, are never going to win you the battle, but they can be the backbone of your army as a whole, especially now that their numbers have been increased. They perform that role much better than they did in the previous version of the game. Defenders of Fornost back here, very, very damaging heavy swordsmen, especially against more lightly armoured troops. We'll see how well they can be used on the open field, a couple of units of them. And we also have a full pike force back here as well. The standard Arthedain pikemen, again, FFAmuffins going for the full armour upgrades, which is good. It gives them that little bit extra solidity over the long haul. And the Illuminous Gate Guards, of course, the higher tier pike unit. Interesting that the pikes are a little bit further back, hoping to avoid perhaps early skirmishing before they inevitably move in, and then a cavalry force off on the flank as well. Royal Court of House Armlaith and Knights of Illuminus, that is a big investment, a bigger investment than Dorwinion have made in their heavy cavalry. We shall see if it proves to be a wise one. If you're going to spend that much money on cavalry, it needs to pay for itself, and Dunland are a force that tend to be pretty good at curtailing cavalry effectiveness, so we'll see. And then a couple of units of Dunland scouts as well. Similar sort of thing as the Morroquendi Stalkers, though they don't have the poison projectiles. I don't know about the damage scores of both sides, but they will do much the same sort of thing, only again without those specialty projectiles that the Morroquendi have. Now over on this side, the red team, KURO and, is it Sin? It's WK standing in for Sin on this occasion, going to be playing as Dunland and Rohan, the most unlikely of alliances, but here we are. The Dunnish Hill Riders, one of the first, I think this might actually be the first time we've seen them, in fact, because seldom do we've only ever seen Dunland in the past, I think, in sieges, and seldom will you see an entry level of Dunlander cavalry, or reasonably entry level as well, I guess, in a siege battle, because Dunland need those numbers really to be effective in that situation. Cavalry can often be a bit of a waste there, but here their mobility is going to be important, albeit against the heft of the Arthedain heavy cavalry and the mobility of the scouts. I think they're going to be used more as a sort of defensive whack-a-mole style unit. The Wolves of Dunland, domesticated wolves. We've seen a similar kind of unit in Silmarillion, I think, in terms of warhounds. Of course, utilising them, it's going to be all about positioning, getting a good charge, causing some chaos. We'll see if they are able to do that. We've got Dunlanding clansmen here at the front, acting as the sort of ablative armour. Numbers, of course, are never going to be an issue for Dunland. Even with equal funds, they are going to have easily a numbers advantage over Arthedain, but they're going to need it because their individual survivability is far more questionable than the men of the West that they're facing down. We have some Danish warband in behind, a mainstay of any Dunland army really. The slings are going to be a good damage dealing tool, and they're not dreadful in melee either. I mean, comparatively speaking, a lot of the Dunland forces are mediocre at the low end at best in melee. So the Danish warband, you're not really losing a great deal by having them be an auxiliary unit of initial infantry anyway. The Ravenborn going to be extremely important in melee because they're one of the best damage dealers Dunland have, especially against armoured forces like Arthedain, and Arthedain have packed the armour on heavily this time, so these 3 units of Ravenborn are a good choice from KURO, but also, you know, Arthedain are always going to be somewhat armour focused. More Danish warband, and then at the back more cavalry, Danish hill riders. This is certainly not all of the Dunlander army, more of them will reveal themselves as time goes on, I'm sure. Meanwhile, their unlikely allies WK playing as Rohan, so I mean we've seen Rohan take to the field already in this tournament, and they did very, very well for themselves actually. Eastmark Spearmen with some javelins, and we've got some Riddermark Axemen as well. I think in terms of the armoured Elvelen units, Rohan are pretty well sorted. How they're going to deal with the elves up close, maybe they won't. Maybe they'll try and do other methods. We've got the Dwarven Catapult over here, which of course is going to be manned by the Dwarves of the Glittering Caves, I would suggest, clad in Rohirrim colours. Probably one of the most heavily armoured units Rohan have actually as well. Interesting to see this thing in action, facing off against Dorwinion as they are. And of course a huge cavalry force. Time will tell whether WK can wrangle all of this cavalry to his advantage, but this is viable now in this version of the game, as we have seen. Rohan facing off against Dorwinion, and I mean stuff like the red shields here, and I'm sure other horse archers as well. Indeed, Riders of the Fold being not quite as heavily armoured as the red shields, but a similar kind of deal. And then also Eastmark horse archers down the end, so a huge advantage on horseback. Those Morroquendi Stalkers are going to find it a little bit difficult, you would suggest. Lords of the Mark and Sons of Aeol, so again, similar to how Arthedain have done it, only even more extreme because there's more cavalry around them. The heaviest cost is going to come in the shape of these guys, and then plenty of Aerid as well. Riddermark skirmishers as well, so a good anti-cavalry unit this, with javelins and axes up close as well. Though, as if Rohan were going to struggle in a cavalry fight, I don't know. I mean, maybe against the Arthedain Knights, but considering the numbers, it's going to be tough for them. Yeah, we'll see. Without further ado, let's get the show on the road. I mean, certainly a more conventional army you would suggest from the blue team, just because having this level of cavalry, while it's not unsurprising for Rohan, it's still difficult to control. Cavalry over there in the distance. That's the catapult. I mean, the Dwarven Catapult, I think, is fairly simplistic in terms of what it offers. I think did that hit? Yeah, it hit the ballista directly, which is, and actually the ballista shielding the rest of the crew. I mean, the ballista is still one of the better choices when it comes to an artillery duel. There is one more artillery piece after all, and it's also going to be reasonably accurate. Dunedain scouts firing away, Wolves of Dunland. Interestingly enough, the firing logo doesn't seem to be present anymore, which I guess is, it takes away some information from the enemy. They have to use their eyes rather than simply hovering their cursor over a unit, which also goes for me, for everyone. Now, as those ballista bolts zip past, at some point in time, almost certainly I'm going to have to indulge in half speed. Meanwhile, Eastmark horse archers, I mean, firing missiles now. Oh no, they're back. I was going to say, I don't know why you get rid of it, but weird. Dunedain scouts not showing that. Riders of the Fold moving in. Again, you may think, why are they just bumping into the units like this, but they can sweep forward with superior numbers, and ultimately Morroquendi Stalkers are going to lose out in terms of sheer value here. In fact, you know, I think I'm just going to go down to half speed now, because it's going to be in these moments where the chaos is reigning. Eastmark Spearmen moving forward as well. I mean, the problem Rohan may have is that they can definitely make Dorwinion uncomfortable with all this cavalry, but seizing territory without a reasonably strong infantry force is going to be a little bit more tricky for them. Dorwinion will have to be content to try and wall up against Rohan's cavalry, and then when they're weak enough, maybe move forwards. Mark Axeman, the Dunland infantry force moving forwards as well. Danish Hill Riders, I mean, it is the red team who are being the aggressors, which, considering the amount of cavalry they have, is maybe more of a necessity than anything else, but the blue team, as long as they don't panic, as long as they keep a reasonably tight formation, I think they should be okay. Dunland scouts and the like, the foot archers from Dorwinion will be doing a decent job as well. Forward come the Royal Court of House Armlade. Lances down, charging into the wolves as the wolves try to move forward and interrupt the wardens of the north. Not particularly successful though. I mean, even if they do get in, maybe a few of the initial ranks will fall, but as soon as the longswords come out, those wolves are surely going to start to struggle mightily. Meanwhile, Riddermark Axemen are moving in, but the River Patrol giving back what the Eastmark Spearmen were giving to Dorwinion, as the axes raised aloft. This will force the retreat of the Morroquendi bows, who are the best countermeasure really to all of the Rohan cavalry. The Rohan cavalry, meanwhile, probably the single most key factor really in this battle as a whole, because if WK can use all of this cavalry, it could really break the back of Dorwinion's infantry reasonably fast. But if they're not able to use it to its fullest, it's an awful lot of the Rohan army and an awful lot of money which has ultimately gone up in smoke, as the riders of the fold able to kill off what remains of those Nandor Glade Riders and rout them. And I doubt they'll be coming back either. Riddermark skirmishers wavering actually as the Elvelyn infantry meet them in melee, swords raised aloft as they try to meet the charge of the Lords of the Mark as well. Not the most hefty charge there, especially considering this is a unit which can devastate whole positions. Hayward of Aldburg moving around. Still those javelins coming in. Now Velen Vinegard will, I mean, to be fair, there's not a huge amount over there other than the red shields anymore. Most of the attention, well, all of the attention of Dorwinion really should be focused towards trying to curtail this cavalry force. What remains will be reasonably easy to deal with, you would suggest. I mean, Eastmark Spearmen are certainly not up to much in melee. Dunland represent the scarier infantry force. Half-Orc Axe Guard revealing themselves. Those throwing axes could be a real problem. At least I think they're still throwing axes, are they? Kind of hard to tell when they're moving like that. The stance would give it away. Dunland do have more infantry, but even they are very heavily reliant on the Ravenborn if they're going to have any sort of real impact against the Arthedainian front line. I mean, certainly just a single year, the Dunland clansmen, over 200 of them routing. That's not a good sign going forwards, you would say. There's still plenty more where that came from, just by the nature of Dunland being who they are, but they can't afford too much of that given the slightly precarious nature of the situation they now find themselves in. The Wolves have definitely spread the battle out a little bit, but they haven't really done the business just yet. The Ravenborn are now arriving, and like I said, the most key unit that Dunland have, and certainly I think the standard Arthedain man-at-arms will not enjoy whatsoever being in melee against those two-handed bilateral axes. No, yeah, the Half-Orc Axe Guard still have their throwing projectiles. I was going to say, it's hard to tell when they're running and you can't see the axes behind the shield in their throwing stance. The armour and the shields will help to mitigate the damage, but throwing axes base damage is so high that if you allow them too many volleys, it's going to be too much to bear for anyone. But they are going to need those volleys. I mean, Dunnish Warband, part of the problem we're seeing here is I think a lot of these throwing projectiles are needed to be used to their fullest, and I don't think Dunland are going to get the opportunity to do that because they need numbers on the front line. Otherwise, Arthedain are going to be feeling reasonably happy with proceedings. Dunedine Rangers revealing themselves as well. Another high damage unit indeed. Heavy pikes as we move back up to 1 speed. So far, I fancy the chances of the blue team, to be honest. I think the red team went for riskier picks, which is fine, as long as you can really score some telling blows. They haven't run out of time to do that, but this is a short battle, so if they're going to do so, they're going to have to do it fast. Morroquendi bows trading fire with Riddermark skirmishers. Usually foot archers win out in a skirmish fight against cavalry, especially when there's layers to those skirmishers. Velen Vinegard getting into melee against more of the Rohirrim cavalry. I don't think they managed to escape into the backfield back here quickly enough, the Rohan cavalry. I mean, not a lot of time has passed, we've been at half speed, but they got caught up on some nonsense over here really from Dorwinion, which suits them down to the ground, but for Rohan, they needed to escape into the open field a bit more quickly, try and cause a few more gaps to appear, and then their lancers could have been really devastating. We could have seen a little bit more of this, where that unit of Alvalan infantry clattered by 2 units of cavalry at once, and the numbers tumbling and they shake and they become shaken. That's what Rohan would have been hoping to do a little bit sooner. Better late than never, but is it going to be enough? Ravenborn caught out on the flank. Danish Hill Riders still buzzing around as well. With Dorwinion sending over more of their infantry over to try and deal with Dunland. Rear charge though, routing as a result of that as well. So we're seeing a little bit more of the cavalry do its thing now. Arthedain men-at-arms rolling forwards. I think actually it's going to have to be half speed again. The Beastmen of Dunland revealed themselves a damaging kind of unit. Got their defensive frailties of course, but to be fair, that damage dealing capability is going to be what they want to utilise to really make the most of their position here. That's a lot of throwing axes coming in as well. Arthedain may be starting to struggle a little bit against Dunland's savagery. Still got the heavy cavalry though of the Knights of Illuminus coming in, and if they can get a few charges off into the Ravenborn, it's exactly the sort of thing which could turn this battle on its, or well, determine the outcome of this battle. Ones of the north firing away, managing to escape into the backfield. We're starting to see the pikes roll forwards as well, which Arthedain do need. They need to make sure Dunland don't build up ahead of steam, and securing their front line with these long spears is going to be their best way of doing that. Arthedain have had some territory lost to the Dunland position. Dunland's scouts moving in, I mean, not quite as deadly as the knights that were making their presence felt just a moment ago. With arrows as well, an imperceptible amount of damage being done over time, but that's certainly going to be in favour of Arthedain when it comes to facing off against Dunland, although to be fair, the slingers and the throwing axes have been doing damage, and they will be doing damage more quickly as well. These Arthedain men-at-arms tumbling in terms of numbers. See what's happening over here. Can Rohan do the business? I mean, to be fair, Dorwinion have siphoned off some of their strength at the very least to try and help deal with the Dunland attack, which that lack of diligence maybe on this side could be to Rohan's great benefit, because they're clearly finding more gaps now. Friendly Stalkers trying to do their thing. River Patrol are over there as well. All of the horse skirmishers, some of them still firing from afar, some of them being forced to get involved in melee. Aaron of Aldberg charging in. Yeah, I mean, Rohan in a better position than they were, you'd have to say. Lords of the Mark, still 24 of them. So Dorwinion scattered over here as it stands. And the battle is looking a little bit stretched, which is to the benefit of cavalry generally, but Arthedain have cavalry of their own, and the Royal Court of House Armlaith and the Knights of Illuminus look to do the same to Dunland as well. So both sides having some initial success on both sides with their infantry, but as the battle gets more stretched, the surviving cavalry is going to be what comes in to cause problems. Knights of Illuminus crunching in. Lancers come down from the Royal Court of House Armlaith as well. I mean, going after Athwalk Axguard and Danish Warband, who have done damage already. I'm sure they haven't used up all their ammunition just yet. But they're going to be forced into a bit of a melee brawl now. More of these pikes rolling forwards to try and blunt the assault of the Beastman. The slings come in. I mean, throwing axes and slingers will be exactly the sort of thing Dunland will be hoping to use against all of these pikes. Speaking of which, the Morroquendi are also arriving, so really trying to bottle Dunland up. Defenders of Fornost and those archers in the distance. As much damage as Dunland have been capable of doing early in this fight, they don't have the same staying power, and a wall of pikes, projectiles coming in, the slow death, if you will. Danish Hill Riders, spears in hand. Eastmark spearmen that returned from routing. I mean, some Dorwinion infantry over here getting involved with the red shields. now we're pretty safe to go back up to 1 speed. And Rohan pretty much have control of this area of the map with all of the cavalry, but playing with their food somewhat. I don't think I think Dorwinion would accept losing over on this side at this point, because they've siphoned off enough resources to face off against Dunland that this is the engagement the blue team are prioritising. Danish Hill Riders coming in though, and with the arrival of some extra Danish warband as well to try and crunch into the side of this formation. And try and do the business against the pikes. Both sides have cavalry, but it's only the blue team that have access to the level of pikemen that make cavalry use truly hazardous for the opposition. My words out, Grey Company arriving as well. Don't know how active they've been already, sneaky as they are, but I believe they're still body-piercing projectiles. Not hugely significant over the long haul in a pitch battle, but still, I mean, considering the blobs actually, maybe that's not correct. Ravenborn maybe haven't been the tour de force I was thinking they could be in this fight, which is probably a bad sign for the Dunlanders, as their infantry continues to fall away. I mean, the Rohan cavalry needs to do something fairly sharpish, because if they don't, their infantry anvil means that they'll just have to charge directly into pikemen, and that will be their only option. The Danish Hill Riders have been really just as active as their Rohan counterparts here, learning from the best as they were. All of that Arthedain cavalry in the background as well. There has been jeopardy in this fight, but it does look as though conventionality is going to win out in the long run, although all of these archers were very exposed. Rohan trying to take advantage of that, but Arthedain have their own cavalry back here to offer a little bit of a shield. I don't think Arthedain will mind too much if their archers are silenced now anyway. I think they've probably done a sufficient amount of damage to be considered worthwhile. Victory almost a certainty for the Beastmen. They've done pretty well actually, the Beastmen, in these melee fights. They've been put into some pretty gnarly situations, and they've managed to do good damage to a solid infantry force. They included pikemen. Ravenborn in and amongst them as well, to be fair. The Rohan general fell earlier, now the Dunland general falls. And with the loss of both generals, that really is a bit of a waymark of how this battle is going. Dorwinion's infantry now fully regrouped over here. Nothing really over on this side other than a few scattered remains of the small Rohan infantry force. Red shields moving across, Dunland Rangers and Ballista crew. What remains of them? The Rohan cavalry force dwindling badly after initially getting bogged down. Yeah, this is going to be a victory for the blue team, which means KURO and WK eliminated. Knockout games after all. You can take a loss in the group stage, but you cannot as the tournament goes on, which means of course Django and FFAmuffins will advance to the semi-finals. To face who? We shall have to wait and see. Actually, I think their opponents may very well. I can't show the bracket because I think the bracket I got showed actually reveals the outcome of one of the semi-finals. All of these games happened in reasonably quick succession, but Dunland Rangers on their way across. There's not much left. I mean, the Beastmen of Dunland are the ones that remain, fighting to the bitter end. These berserker style units, they do not fear death. But death is something they're going to have to engage with sooner than they may like. I think that may very well be the Dunlanders gone. So Rohan still have something perhaps? Yeah, one Riddermark skirmisher way over in the distance, but I think it's going to be an admission of defeat here based on the amount of frames that remain. But that skirmisher will live to see another day, but nothing else. Lords of the Mark, 10 of them, they're going to rout and flee, and that is going to be that. A good victory that. Again, the more conventional picks, I think, saw them through. That mass cavalry approach from Rohan, I think, was the key upon which the red team's hopes would hinge, and it can work. We have seen it work actually in this version of the game, but I think just got held up for a little bit too long on the side of Dorwinion there when they really needed to get into the backfield, I think. And then it maybe would have made Dorwinion a little bit more wary about committing that infantry early to help deal with the Dunland advance against Arthedain, which, without that Dorwinion support, I don't know if the Arthedain infantry would have been able to hold out against the Beastmen and the Ravenborn and the numbers that Dunland were committing, especially when you consider the damage the throwing axes and the slingers were adding in. Yes, the Arthedain archers were doing damage as well, especially considering the light armour of Dunland. But I think you could certainly say that the throwing projectiles of Dunland at least level that out. I would suggest actually tilt it slightly in their favour. But I think a good, well-won victory, excuse me, from Dorwinion and Arthedain. That good use of their armies. I think the cavalry from Arthedain was used well, the horse archers and such. The infantry as well did its job against a force which was capable of dealing the damage necessary to get through the armour, so they held out well. Dorwinion, the elven archers, the damage from afar, certainly did its bit. We didn't actually see the high tier cavalry of Dorwinion. It got lost in the mire a little bit, which you'd expect against the force that Rohan had. But you'd have to say, I mean, we'll have a look and see what the damage was. Glade Lords, yeah, 38, they were really used as more of a defensive measure, but you have to when you see a cavalry force like that. Stalkers did decently. Bows, again, all of those elven archers with the poison projectiles. Don't know how much the routing really came into it. More routing we saw was from the rear charges here, but in a relatively short and sweet battle like this, not too surprising. One unit of Elven infantry doing very well, but there wasn't a huge amount of Rohirrim to actually kill off in melee, so a lot of the melee infantry units would have had to get their kills a little bit later against Dunland. 285 on those Moraquendi pikes. That's a very good return on a field battle that only took this long. But yes, Django and FFAmuffins will advance to the next round. And next, I think the other qualifier was maybe a little bit more one-sided, which is why the replays weren't forthcoming. But now we shall move on to the semi-finals in the tournament, one of which I know has already been run, which will be the next tournament battle that we see. Following on from that, we will have the next semi-final, and then we'll move on to the grand final, and we shall see who wins out overall, getting down to the business end now. But yeah, big thank you to all the players that were a part of this one. Big thank you to Alexios22 as well, who sent me this battle replay as one of the tournament organisers. He's been keeping track of everything as it happens, and he's sent me the vast majority of these as they've been going on, so big thank you to him as well. And yeah, we'll see another one very soon, so I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.